Hi, my name is Thomas Siggillino. I'm a rising senior at Lehigh University in the Material Science Engineering Department, and today I'm going to be talking about how we can use machine learning to analyze the microstructure of polymer-derived ceramics, more specifically polymer-derived silicon carbide fibers. Okay. So first I'm going to give a brief overview of what machine learning is exactly and try to give you a basic idea of how it works. So in a sense, machine learning is really a more sophisticated form of linear regression. It's a model generating method that constantly calculates how far off the existing model is from representing the data, and then tweaks that model a little bit over and over again until it's a reasonably good fit for the data. So machine learning does this process for as many as thousands of variables at a time, making it suitable for generating models with complex phenomena. Some of the classic examples of machine learning neural networks that have been applied are in recognizing digits or letters, facial recognition, and speech processing recognition. It has also been successfully applied to analyzing material microstructures, such as in this uranium and molybdenum alloy system, where it is used to relate subtle microstructural features to samples annealing time. Okay, so now to get into how it works. This diagram shows an abbreviated form of what the architecture of your standard convolutional neural network, or CNN, looks like. So the circles represent neurons, which are really just variables that store a number between 0 and 1. The arrows represent numbers called weights, which can be any rational number, negative or positive. And the value that each neuron holds, called as activation, is equal to the sum of all the activations of neurons in the previous layer multiplied by their respective weights, plus an additional value that each neuron holds called the bias. And the bias is just an additional number that is added as a factor to each neuron's activation to prevent certain neurons from being overactive or not responsive enough. So how does this architecture actually work to create a function model? Well, if we use the handwritten digits or letters, for example, the first layer in the CNN or the input layer would contain the grayscale values of all the pixels in the image of the handwritten digit or letter. So each neuron would correspond to one pixel in the image with completely white pixels giving off neurons with an activation of 1 and completely black pixels giving them an activation of 0. So if the neural network has been properly trained to become a good model, the weights leading to the second layer and the biases in the second layer would be optimized in such a way that each neuron in the second layer might represent a specific feature in the image. So for instance, one neuron might have a high activation when a straight horizontal edge appears near the top or middle of the image, such as when you're writing a digit 7. Or another neuron might activate if there's a curved line near the bottom of the image, such as in the 6th or 8th. And so these neurons might in turn activate larger patterns in the next layer. So if there's a neuron corresponding to the loop of the bottom of a 6 or an 8, that might activate one neuron, or a sharp middle bend in a 3. So eventually the goal is to have the final output layer having one neuron corresponding to the thing you want the CNN to identify. So if you're just classifying the handwritten digits, then this last layer would just have 10 neurons with each one corresponding to one digit. Okay, so how would you actually go about developing one of these models from scratch? So the first thing you need is to collect a lot of training data and to label it. So if we're going to continue with the handwritten digit example, this would be thousands of pictures of handwritten digits marked with the actual number that they represent. Then you start to initialize your CNN model with random values for each of your weights and biases, if you're really starting from scratch. Oftentimes, though, its training is a lot faster and more effective when you start with a neural network that's already been trained to do some basic or general tasks like recognize basic image features. And then you train it further to do specifically more what you want it to do. Okay, so then once you have your starting values for your model, you can test it on your label training data and see how its outputs compare to the actual labels. So starting with a randomly initialized model for handwritten digit recognition, we can continue that example. If you feed the model with a picture of a 7, the output layer would just have random activations for all 10 digits or all 10 neurons. So ideally, you would want just the neuron corresponding to the digit 7 to have an activation of 1, and all other neurons to have activations of 0. So to evaluate how well the CNN performed on this particular training example, you would then add up the squared differences between what the output layer actually gave you for each neuron and what you ideally would have it be. So if you continue adding to this number the errors you get for all your training examples, not just the 7, but the thousands of training examples you have, then you start to estimate the value of something called the cost function. The cost function basically represents all of the possible models that could exist for your given CNN architecture and training data and how well each one would fit the data. So the lower value of the cost function, the better the model fits the data, really. So although this is just a 3D representation here, that's just for the sake of easy visualization. In reality, the cost function has as many variables as there are weights and biases in the network, so it would really be thousands of dimensions. That's just reality check there. So once you've estimated the value of the cost function for the current version of your model, random values if you're starting from scratch, then you can begin to make improvements through a procedure called backpropagation. So the goal of backpropagation is to estimate the negative gradient of the cost function, which means to determine which variables of the cost function, that's the weights and biases, should be changed and to what degree they should be changed to most quickly reduce the value of the cost function. So to perform backpropagation, you start with the output layer, rather than the input, and for a given training example, and then determine how the weights, biases, and activations from the previous layer could be changed to most efficiently reduce the cost. So if we go back to the example with the picture of a 7 as the training example you're working with, then this would mean you want to increase the weights connected neurons from the previous layer to have a high activation, the neuron that represents the digit 7 in the output layer. And conversely, you'd want to decrease weights that connect highly activated neurons to the previous layer to all the other neurons in the output layer, all the digits that aren't 7. So at the same time, you want to adjust the activations to the previous layer, such that those neurons that already have a large positive weight connecting them to the 7 neuron, so neuron that represents 7, in the output layer get brighter, and that those are connected to other output layer neurons with high weight values get darker. So of course, the only way to affect the activations of the second layer, or the second to last layer, is to adjust the weights, biases, and activations from the layer before that. So what you're really doing is you're repeating the process for the next layer and so on until you get desired changes for the output layer, and you backpropagate through the entire network. That's why it's called backpropagation. This process is repeated for every training example in the data set, and the desired changes to all the weights and biases are averaged. So that essentially gives you an estimation of the negative gradient of the cost function, which is what we were after in the first place, and how the model should be changed to most quickly improve its performance. So once it's been adjusted from that that one iteration of backpropagation, then you begin the process all over again, and you do it essentially over and over until you get like the desired level of accuracy and accurate reference data, and hopefully it'll also generalize to other data sets that are beyond what you just trained it on. So I hope that gave you like a good general idea of how machine learning works through convolutional neural networks. So I'm going to shift the focus more to material science aspects of my project by talking about an analysis technique whose data is pretty well fit to machine learning methods, and it's called Electron Backscatter Diffraction. So this is a technique that is generally performed inside of a scanning electron microscope setup, and it provides crystallographic information about the surface of the sample. It's kind of like a combination of electron microscopy and XRD. The basic physical operating principle is this. So when high energy electrons enter the sample from the microscope beam, many of them are scattered inelastically from the atomic electron cloud. So some of them will be scattered back towards the sample surface or escape the specimen in different directions. And depending on what the direction is, some of them will satisfy Bragg conditions based on the crystal structure of the sample, and that will perform a diffraction pattern if you place an electron detector above the sample to detect those backscattered electrons. The diffraction pattern largely consists of these bands you see in this example down here, and those are called Kikuchi bands. And the places where those bands are intersecting, you see those kind of like star shapes. Those correspond to crystallographic axes in the crystal structure for zone axes. And what you can do is you can measure the angle between Kikuchi bands and zone axes, and that can give you pretty good information about the crystal structure or the orientation of the sample at the point where the electron beam is hitting it. So then when you raster the electron beam across the sample surface and collect diffraction patterns at each point, crystallographic information can be correlated to specific points on the sample. So that's really useful. And this often gives this can allow you to determine relative orientations of grains and polycrystal materials. That's what the example of the zinc oxide crystal is showing there with columnar grains, where the colors of the grains indicate the crystallographic direction that you're viewing it from, essentially. Okay. So how can this be applied to study polymer-derived silicon carbide fibers, like I mentioned at the beginning? The tricky thing about crystallography of silicon carbide is that it's somewhat infamous for having lots of potential variations in its crystal structure, despite having the same composition between those different variations. These variations are called polymorphs, and there are over 250 of them that have been identified just for silicon carbide. So a subset of these polymorphs are called polytypes, and those are instances where the crystal structure is identical in two directions, but differs in the third direction. That's because of different ways the atomic planes stack on top of each other. So these different stacking sequences can lead to wide variations in the lattice parameters of the polytype unit cells. In addition, the polytypes that make up a given silicon carbide specimen can affect its properties. Usually, most significantly, it's electronic properties, but there's also evidence that it can affect high temperature properties such as like thermomechanical responses or maybe oxidation behavior. Okay. So this is where a combination of eBSD and machine learning to analyze the resulting data can become useful. So we want to look at a cross-section of a polycrystalline silicon carbide fiber and basically determine which grains are made up of what polymorph of silicon carbide, and perhaps even what their orientations are. So this could be useful not only for predicting how the fiber may perform at elevated temperatures, but it may also provide some insight into how pyrolysis and the starting composition of the pre-ceramic polymer blend could lead to crystal growth. But unfortunately, it's unlikely that traditional eBSD data processing methods are up to the task of distinguishing between these phases in silicon carbide. The standard method for processing eBSD data, puff transforms, does neglect much of the crystallographic information that's present in the original diffraction patterns. So machine learning could solve this problem and provide an effective alternative method by analyzing each diffraction pattern individually to extract more detailed crystallographic information about each point in the specimen. Also, since each eBSD measurement generates thousands of diffraction patterns, there should be sufficient data to properly train a neural network for this task. So in terms of an experimental plan, so far I unfortunately haven't been able to access lab facilities to carry out this work because of COVID-19 restrictions. However, I am just beginning to gain back lab access, and so I plan to carry on with this work on into the fall. So the general experimental plan that I have outlined here is to prepare a set of silicon carbide fiber samples by mounting them in epoxy and polishing them, and then collect a set of diffraction patterns using the microscopy suite at Lehigh University. And I'll then identify an existing neural network that mostly closely resembles the one I would like to train, and most likely one that's been trained to identify basic features of eBSD diffraction patterns already. And this goes back to what I said, where it's like generally easier to like further train an existing network than to start from scratch. And so then what I'll do is, once the CNN is able to accurately identify structural information after I've trained it on my specific data and labeled all the data, then hopefully we'll be able to generalize to other silicon carbide diffraction patterns, and then we'll use it to analyze all the unlabeled diffraction pattern data I have, and hopefully get images of the fiber that have been segmented according to their constituent phases. So something that might look like those at the bottom. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening to my presentation.